Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a digital and analog game designer that has worked on some of the biggest properties in board gaming with a strong proclivity for the Lovecraftian. She's designed Eldritch Horror, Legacy of Dragonholt, and the universally acclaimed Arkham Horror 3rd Edition. She's also an advocate for inclusivity in gaming. My guest this week is Nikki Valens. Nikki, welcome to the cabin.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be safe from the apocalypse.
Well, I mean, safe is a relative term, but at least you won't get rained on. So, to begin with, how difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games to take to the cabin with you?
It was a pretty interesting decision. Some of them were pretty obvious for me, and other ones I kind of had to decide what they meant for me to choose them. So a couple of them are more of a decision that is representing a category of games. And in what categories were they fulfilling? And is this a sort of a genre thing, or is this more of this is a thing I played as a kid, or this is something I played on a holiday and it has a wonderful memory for me? Kind of a little bit of all of it. Some of them are sentimental, some of them are more of just genres that I'm interested in, or different itches that I need to scratch every now and then with some gaming.
And so sort of, what are games to you as objects? Are you a materialistic person? Do you like having the games around you, or would you be happy to see them all go up in smoke and just have these 5 left for the rest of eternity?
I don't really care about physical possessions all that much. I actually only own, I think, somewhere around 20 games. So not very many in comparison to a lot of other designers that I know of. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's just games are about the fun and the social interaction and having a good experience with some friends or family and getting to know people better.
And so is that I mean, you're a designer, so when you're playing games with friends, with family, when you're playing them for fun, can you ever turn off that analytical node in your brain? Are you always thinking, oh, I'd make this different, or this is fantastic, I need to remember this?
It's pretty rare for that to happen. There's only a couple games that really let me do that, but most of the time, especially if I'm playing a new game, I'm constantly analyzing it and thinking about how I would have designed something similar, or what things stick out to be, inspirational for me, or that are just cool things that I hadn't thought of before. So I can't. It's really hard for me to turn off that part of my brain and just enjoy a game. But there are a few games that let me do that.
And is this a qualitative thing, or is this more like sort of I could change the game to make it more to my tastes, or is it I want to make this better?
It's not necessarily about changing the games or making them better or more suited for how I like games. It's more of just I'm really passionate about game design, and I love seeing what other people have done, and I love thinking about how all of the different games fit together, how their pieces fit together and what they do, and just kind of seeing all of the different things that people have come up with to create all of these different games that we have.
And I mean, you said there's a couple of games that allow you to switch off that sort of analytical node in your brain. What is it about them that does that? Is it sort of narrative immersion? Is it, the scaffolding floats away? What is it?
I think it's the ones that have the more sentimental value to them to me. The ones that either I've played for a long time or they've meant something to me in like really important times in my life. where those specific games are to me about the experience of playing it and less about it being a game specifically.
Yeah, I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about how sort of the most wonderful experience, and it so rarely happens, is where you sit down, all of you around the table, you get the game out, you set it up, and there's no rules explanation, and you just start playing. How often does that happen to you, or are you one of these peripatetic gamers that jumps around from game to game and is constantly playing new things?
It's a little of both. I definitely like to try a lot of new games. So when new stuff is coming out, I like to play it. I'm also the person that it's a lot easier for me to learn the rules either by just playing it or by reading the rules myself. So a rules explanation from someone else usually does me very little good at all. And I would much rather just start playing a game. But the handful of games that I've played a lot, especially with the people that I play games with often, being able to just sit down and play those games without the rules explanation of any kind, and everyone just kind of knows what's going on, it is a treat to have that.
And are you good at games? Are you someone who wins a lot? Because I was talking to another friend about this, and I'm terrible. I almost never win. Even the games I think I'm going to win at the end, I always end up coming last. Does being a designer help you be better at games?
In a lot of ways, it probably does. Just my ability to analyze different systems and see how they interact and understand very quickly like what things are, powerful effects in games or something like that. Although I play a lot of co-op games, so they're not necessarily about winning the game or, beating an opponent or anything like that. So a lot of them are just kind of learning the game together with, whoever I'm playing with and just kind of having the experience. I don't really care about winning all that much. Although when we do play competitive games, I'm usually kind of near the top of the rankings in terms of just if there's, someone has to win, I'll usually put the pieces together a little bit quicker in terms of like our first couple of games of something.
And there are those people, I have a friend of mine who's particularly sort of strident on this, that co-ops are just single-player games with extra components. What would you say to people who say that?
That co-op games are single-player games with extra components?
Yeah, so it's basically a solo game, but, you have a pawn for each person around the table, but essentially they're not multiplayer experiences, they're solo experiences.
I think they might be playing different co-op games than I am, because to me there's a lot more there that's about teamwork and cooperation than it simply being multiple people playing a solo experience. And I certainly wouldn't call my friends who I'm playing the game with additional components. They are definitely a part of that experience that makes it as special as it is.
And is the alpha player thing a myth? Is it just a matter of someone's just not being considerate to the people around the table?
That's a really good question. It's one that I come back to every now and then. In my group, it's not really a problem. We discuss our opinions and what we think are good strategies pretty openly, and in general are in agreement about what needs to happen in a game. So I haven't experienced the alpha gamer problem all that much firsthand, but I've definitely heard pretty terrible horror stories about what that experience can be like. So I know that it's certainly real for some people, and whether that's specific players that are causing that issue or if it's just a dynamic between certain groups of friends, or I would say it probably happens even more in situations where you're not playing with people that you know all that well. If you're playing at games at a convention with some strangers, it's possibly much more likely that you're dealing with someone that just doesn't know you and doesn't know your level of skill or ability to read the game or their ability to read the social environment.
So let's go back to the beginning then. When did games first come into your life? Are you someone who sort of played them at your grandmother's knee, or is it a sort of a newer thing?
Very, very early in my life. I've been playing games basically as long as I can remember, whether it was just card games with my family or playing board games or role-playing games. I learned how to play Magic the Gathering very early, when I was like 6 or something like that. So hobby games and fantasy games especially have been a part of my life virtually as long as I can remember, being able to form actual coherent thoughts of my own.
And whereabouts did you grow up? And was there a sort of vibrant gaming scene in that area?
I grew up in a town called Winona, which is in the kind of South Minnesota area. It's a pretty small town. I wouldn't say there was a huge gaming crowd. There's for a long time there was just kind of one comic and game shop, and others opened up or closed down as the years went on. But it was mostly just kind of the one shop, and then having the group of friends that wanted to role play and wanted to play games and play cards, and having a family that also enjoyed playing games.
And did your family join in with you with the more sort of esoteric role-playing games, or was that specifically you had one set of games that you played with your friends and one set of games that you played with your family?
It depends on the members of the family. I remember my grandma and an uncle of mine who were into kind of the fantasy games, and there was a couple different games that I never actually got to play, although I heard tons of stories about them that were just these really old, like, Camelot games and stuff. But my brother was into Magic and Warhammer and role-playing as well, so I kind of grew up exposed to a lot of hobby games. And then playing with my mom and, other grandparents and just other siblings and stuff, just playing card games and having that as a activity to do during holidays and such.
And I guess the only thing I know really about Minnesota is that it is insanely cold in the winter. Do you think that lends indoor activities like gaming sort of more credence where you're from?
Maybe. I mean, it's definitely not a lot going to happen outside in the middle of winter in Minnesota, unless you're into like snowmobiling or something. But in terms of doing something and hanging out with family and staying warm, yeah, board gaming and card gaming is a really great hobby to be able to share with your friends and family.
And sometimes people ask British people if they know some British celebrity, as if everyone from Britain knows each other. But have you ever met the Coen brothers?
I have not met the Coen brothers, nor Bob Dylan or many other celebrities from Minnesota.
So no Prince either, then?
No.
So it seems to me, I was looking through your Twitter when I was sort of writing up the show notes, and you have a real passion for games on the one hand, and then you have a real passion for animals on the other. Did you have a lot of pets as a child? Did you grow up surrounded by animals?
Not nearly as many as I would have liked to. We had a couple of pet cats growing up, who eventually my grandmother started taking care of them, so they kind of moved in with my grandma. We had a dog very briefly, but the cats did not get along with the dog, so the dog had to go somewhere else. And much to my mother's horror, I had a pet rat for a couple of years as well.
And, I mean, I have a sort of Winston Smith-esque repulsion of rats. What are they like as pets? People say they're super intelligent and loving. Is this true?
Rats get a super bad rap. They are very smart and they're incredibly affectionate. The one I had, whose name is Isabel, would just love to kind of just crawl on me and like kind of hang out on my shoulder or next to my neck or something and just kind of take treats out of my hand and, just be a very affectionate friend.
And so what does having pets, being around animals do? How does it enhance your life?
I think they're just these great, happy little creatures that don't have the worries that we do as humans. They get to, enjoy the world for what it is and share that joy with us. I mean, anyone that has a pet dog definitely knows the unbridled excitement that they just bring to your life, because they are just always happy and want you to be happy too.
And what about, because obviously animals they live a fraction of the duration that we live. Is sort of taking an animal into your home a sort of, do you trade off with the idea that you're going to have to watch this friend of yours die? And how do you cope with that?
It's definitely rough that's going to happen eventually, but that is the way of life. Our human families and friends will also leave us someday, and it's best to remember the good times that you've had together and not be afraid to make bonds and make memories that will last beyond their lifetimes.
So you also worked as a computer game designer. What were you doing?
So I went to school for video game design, but in terms of actually having anything published, that never really happened. I got into board gaming very, very quickly after being in school. So the professional side of video game design never really got to me. But I've done programming, and I've done a little bit of modeling and animation. I've done playtesting, of course. So it's a little bit of everything. But I would say that just the design work itself and programming were my kind of main focuses.
And is there any connection between digital game design and analog game design, or are they completely different disciplines?
They share a lot of the same philosophies. So what is a game and what does a game mean to players? Those things are true regardless of the medium that you're working with. So everything that I learned about creating video games kind of still translates to analog games. And even if the technical skills of 3D modeling or animating don't necessarily translate, a lot of the core concepts of why those are important also translate. You're talking about aesthetics and art and graphic design and what those mean to players of your game.
You said you studied video game design. At any point during the study, were you asked to look at sort of designing analog games as a sort of basis for what you did in the digital world?
We were actually. Very early, one of our very first classes was about analyzing games, and not just as video games, but games as a concept, as an experience that players can have. And we actually broke out some hobby games and played them and analyzed them, and then discussed what is it about them that makes them attractive to players. The game that group was actually tasked with playing and learning the rules was Arkham Horror 2nd Edition, which was a pretty interesting twist of fate.
So your first game then is Mahjong, and this is a classic. Why is this one going to the cabin?
So this one is one of those few games that I mentioned that I can just turn off the analytical part of my brain and just really let the game be what it is and enjoy it. And for any of the listeners that are curious, we're talking about the this kind of set collection, almost card game-like game, not the solitaire matching game. And Mahjong it's just a very zen experience. It's a 4-player game. It is a competitive game. It's one of the only ones that I enjoy in the long term. And it's, I don't know, there's a certain quality about it that is just very relaxing, but very tense at the same time. There's a buildup of anticipation of everyone being able to tell that the other players are getting close to a winning hand, and just kind of that tense race of getting to a victory first. But at the same time, it's very easy to have it just be a slow and calming and zen-like experience without the stress of or worry of other games.
And do you think there's something innately attractive to the tactility of those pieces? Does that aid the experience?
Very much so. The feeling, the weight of them in your hand, the sound of the pieces clinking together. It's I don't know, it's just very relaxing. It's got a nice quality to it in terms of the physicality, and it's definitely not the same playing it. You could play the game with a card version, but playing it with the tiles and the weight of the pieces is something else that just feels really good.
And this is a sort of classic Eastern game. Do you see anything in its design that is distinct from Western modes of game design?
It's very clearly a game that is derived from tradition. Even the modern rule set of it that I play with most commonly is very clearly derived from tradition. Some of the scoring hands are very clearly based on fables or different kinds of lore from the creating cultures, but it's not. It feels somehow less gamey than a lot of other things, but at the same time, it has a lot of mechanical depth to it.
Does it feel like, because I must confess I've never played it myself, does it feel like the old abstract games? Does it feel like Go? Does it feel like chess?
In some ways. I mean, it's certainly not attempting to recreate something what Go is, where it's a sort of abstraction of a battlefield. But it has a similar kind of push and pull of trying to gain incremental advantage over your opponents. And the strategies run very deep, and the more you learn about how to play it and the better you get at playing it, you can identify the strategies that your opponents are using very early, and then form a counter strategy to work against that.
So this is a game that people gamble on, and I think of poker, and poker is kind of pointless without the money. It's just not a game that stands without actually having something riding on it. Do you ever play this for stakes, or is this a game that stands up without the need to gamble?
It is a game that I've never played for any kind of stakes before. I think it stands up on its own as a great experience. But I definitely see the allure of playing it for some kind of stakes. There's a friend of mine who I've played the game with quite frequently, and every now and then he suggests that we should play it for money, which is, I always find a interesting suggestion from him specifically, because I think he's maybe beat me once at the game in all of the times we've played.
Well, some things do change when money's involved. So I want to go on now and talk about your designing. So when did designing games enter your life? Was it something that always accompanied gaming, or was this something that happened relatively late?
I think my design tendencies started very early. When I think about playing games as a child, I thought about how to create my own games Not necessarily changing the ones that I had played, but just creating my own versions of things. Especially in middle school, I was in a role-playing club, but we very rarely played any established role-playing game like a D&D or anything like that. Much more frequently, we just would make up our own systems. So during that period of my life, I made up 3, 4, 5 different role-playing systems that just kind of worked in different settings and did the few things that I needed them to do. But a lot of those games were more about storytelling and less about the mechanics, so they didn't really have all that much going on. But in terms of starting to think about game design, it happened very early.
And they always say a sort of sign of a natural aptitude towards something is that it comes easily. Is designing for you easy, or is it, because I think when I write, every word sort of feels like it's being dredged out of me. Is designing an easy process for you, or is there a lot of backbreaking labor involved?
I think if I were to compare my experiences of design to other people's, it is probably something that comes easy to me. Oftentimes people ask me, like, where do I get my design ideas, or, you know, how do I decide how to do different parts of my games? And a lot of it really just kind of comes to me. It's really hard for me to explain where the ideas come from or what drives my decision process in terms of which way I think a design needs to go. A lot of it is just something that feels right, or it just kind of sticks out in my mind as being something that I would like to try, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but the best ideas are the ones that stick and then become actual games.
So how does a person become a better designer? So in your experience, have you sort of ploughed a lone furrow and just worked and iterated and got better? Or have there been people in your life that were great influences that have sort of mentored you through the world of design?
So like pretty much everything, practice will always improve what you are doing. And in this case, design is very frequently about iteration. If you want to design games, you can just start designing games, and even if they're not good at the beginning, all you need to do is take a look at what you've created, start to feel out why it isn't as good as you want it to be, and work with what you have and work with feedback from your playtesters to just kind of iterate and try new things. Don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. If you try something and it doesn't work out, you've learned from that experience, you've learned from that design, and you can move forward and create something better as you go.
How do you know something's not very good? Do you see your playtesting group playing it and you think, oh my God, they're not enjoying this? Or is it a matter of the playtesters coming back to you and saying, look, I'm really sorry, but it didn't really work?
It's something that you should be able to just feel. If you're, I mean, as a player of a game, if you're playing something and you think to yourself, I'm not having fun right now, that's something that's inherent to you. You can feel that. You know what that feels like already. And the same is true of when you're designing something. I was recently working on a design, and after iterating a few times and continuing to do playtesting, I found myself during one of the playtests thinking to myself, I'm not having fun. I don't want to play this anymore. And like, that's just such an obvious tip-off to me of I've gone the wrong direction. I just need to go a different direction with this design and find something else for this to work with, because what I've created here isn't fun. It's not a game.
And so all of your games seem to have, you know, a strong narrative component. And I didn't want to ask the obvious question, what comes first, theme or mechanics, but a slight twist on that, sort of, do you design a narrative first and then put components of, mechanism into that? Or do you design the scaffolding of the game and then build a narrative around that design?
It depends on the game. Both of those are things that I've done in the past and will continue to do. Sometimes I have a story to tell and I just have to find the mechanical framework that allows me to tell that story the way I want to tell it. And other times there's a set of mechanics or maybe even a specific single mechanic that I want to play with. And it's about just finding the story that matches that game feel, the way that I want it to.
And how important is it for you that game design or the narrative in game design reflect your views on the world, or is that not a part of it?
That is very important to me personally. It's not necessarily that important to all designers, but for me personally, I want to tell stories that reflect my life and experiences. I want my players to be able to see their experiences and their lives in the stories and the characters that I create. Or in the case of a game that they can create a character, I want them to be able to create a character that they feel fits who they are as a person and can live in the world that I've created in a way that feels natural and welcoming to them.
And you talked about, being into fantasy and playing fantasy games. Is creating a fantasy world about creating the world that you would like to see in reality?
In a lot of ways. In some cases, it's more of just, here's an interesting challenge that could be presented to the players in a world, or just very small changes to what the real world could be like that have much deeper meaning to the everyday life that isn't necessarily something completely different from what we're used to, but is a fun twist on what we already know.
So your next game then is one of my favourites, and this is Broom Service. What does this game do that singles it out? What makes it special?
So this is an interesting one. I don't actually own this game myself, but the first time I played it was somehow eye-opening to me. I played through the game, and at the end of it, I just felt so incredibly fulfilled by what the experience gave me that I exclaimed that it's probably the best game I had ever played up to that point. In terms of just the design and the theme, all of the different pieces of it just kind of fit together in a very fulfilling, very succinct way that just felt complete.
And how is your view on it now? I assume you've played it subsequently. Does it still hold that sort of that special feeling for you?
It does. I've only played it a couple times since the very first time, but anytime that I've played it, I just am kind of I just remember and re-feel everything that I felt the first time, and each of those games has always ended with, this is just such a good experience. Like, it does exactly what I want it to do. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It doesn't lack for anything that I wish it had. It just kind of does exactly what I want. And it's just a very fun, fulfilling experience.
Yeah, and this is a game that, to some degree, I mean, for a Euro game especially, lives above the table. It's about reading what the players around the table are going to pick. Are they going to play brave? Are they going to play cowardly? And it all sort of hinges on that. Do you like that above-table interaction between players?
Very much so. I think it's the thing that makes me care about this game as much as I do. I never really thought of it as a Euro game before you mentioned it, but I guess it does share a lot of similar mechanics and components as Euro games do. But to me, the kind of bluffing aspect and the reading each other around the table and kind of guessing what each other's strategies are going to be and what people are going to try to do and what order they're going to do it is very interesting. There's definitely being able to like read into what the other players are doing and play in a way that whatever they plan to do isn't going to disrupt your plan, or one step above that, playing in a way that you still accomplish what you want to that turn and you can disrupt their plans in the process.
And so, as a designer, if there's one thing you'd take away from this game, what would it be?
I think it's that seemingly different and separate mechanics can work together to create something really incredible. The idea of resource management and area control feels very Eurogamey now that you've called it a Eurogame. But also the kind of turn planning and strategy and bluffing aspect feels very different from that, but the two portions of the game fit together so well that it's just a great reminder that things that don't feel connected can work incredibly well together and create an experience that's unlike anything else.
So I want to go on now and talk about sort of an area of game design that most designers don't experience, and this is working as a contracted staff designer. So you worked as a staff designer for Fantasy Flight for 5 years. What are the kind of the inner workings of working for a company? So firstly, what are the sort of broadly main differences between doing that and being a freelancer?
I think it definitely depends on what your relationship is like with publishers as a freelancer, but as a staff designer, you might have a lot more responsibilities that fall to you. For my position with FFG, I wasn't just a designer, I was also a producer. I wrote art descriptions, I worked out budgets for my games. There's a lot of other aspects to it than just the design itself, which isn't necessarily true depending on what publisher I'm working with as a freelancer. It might just be that I have a design for a game and I create some of the content, but then the graphic design and the art and everything else is just kind of out of my hands and someone else's responsibility and focus. But there's definitely a lot more freedom with being a freelancer. I can work on any type of game that I feel I want to work on, whereas working with a studio directly, the upper management and executive level people at the studio are going to have ideas of what the studio should be producing, what kind of games should it be releasing, what's the schedule for those games to be releasing, etc. So it's much more rigid and structured as a workflow.
And so how did you get your job at FFG?
I just saw a posting for the position and I thought to myself, that's something that I would like to do and I think I can do that. And I submitted my resume and a RPG book that I had been working on at the time, just as a example of my work. And clearly they liked what they saw and liked me in the interview and brought me on board. And
so how were the games sort of divvied out among the designers. So, I mean, you designed Eldritch Horror, and then you went on to do Legacy of Dragonholt and Arkham Horror 3rd Edition. I mean, did you lobby for those games, or was it, Nikki, you go off and you work on that?
It's a little of both. In the beginning, as a newer employee, it was more of just, all right, here's the project we're going to have you work on, which was the case with like Eldritch Horror or Mansions 2nd Edition as well. With Mansions, it also was dependent on my background as a digital designer. They knew they wanted Mansions to have a digital component, and basically just brought me in to be like, is this something you would want to work on since you have this expertise to be able to do this? And in that case, Mansions is something that the theme of Mansions and what it is as a game is something that I was very interested in. So I was really excited to work on that. But for the first couple of years there, it was just kind of, these are the games that we want to do. And either I got assigned to something, or they would ask me which of a small set of games that were going to get created that year I would prefer to work on. And I was open about the types of games that I like to do. They knew that I wanted to work on co-op games. They knew that I enjoyed storytelling and role-playing. And I had been vocal about wanting to create something that had a more narrative focus with a lot of written text and some books. So eventually, when they had a slot available, they asked if I wanted to create something more narrative, and that is where Legacy of Dragonholt came from. I've had this idea for a long time of a game I wanted to create, and they saw an opportunity for me to do that and saw the opening in the market for a game like that to be popular and gave me the shot.
And so, were you a Lovecraft fan before working on those games, or was this whole world of the mythos something you had to bone up on?
I actually knew almost nothing about the Lovecraft mythos before starting at FFG, but because I was on Eldritch Horror as my first project, I just very quickly figured out how I would get all this information about these things, like reading all the stories and looking through Wikipedia entries and encyclopedias about the mythos, and just very quickly picking up all of the knowledge and lore that goes into the game. The first, few months that I was there was just a lot of learning, but eventually I had done so much research into it and read enough of the stories, or at least summaries of the stories, to have like a complete understanding of the Lovecraft lore and how it related to our specific Arkham Horror brand of the lore. And eventually we created story groups within the studio to kind of oversee how our different IPs would progress, and to make sure that there was an amount of consistency and tone within each of the IPs. And due to just the sheer amount of research I had to do for Eldritch Horror and then Mansions as well, I was on the Arkham story group.
And did you feel any pressure doing the 3rd edition for Arkham Horror? Because it's a really well-loved title.
Absolutely. I felt that pressure right away on Eldritch Horror as well. I had known that Arkham 2nd Edition was a very popular game that had a huge following. And after Mansions Amended 2nd Edition, I had a feeling that when it sort of felt inevitable an Arkham 3rd Edition would come eventually. And it also felt pretty clear to me that I would be the one doing it. So I started thinking about what I would want a 3rd edition to be like a year and a half before I actually started working on it, just as a mental exercise of sorts. But definitely I felt the pressure of, this is a very beloved title and a very popular product that was released and still being played by so many people, it would be impossible to make everyone happy. Like, I kind of knew that going in, that there were people that loved it exactly the way it was, or that only wanted a few things changed, and there was definitely people that would have liked to see an entirely new game or have a lot of things with that game changed. So there was really no way to please everyone, but FFG's methodology with making new additions isn't to simply recreate what was already there. It's to kind of create a new game entirely that draws inspiration from where it came from. So a lot of my focus was on figuring out the key components of second edition that really made people like fall in love with it as a game, and focusing on those things and trying to capture some of that atmosphere and mood that made it as popular as it was.
And so how do you feel it came out in the end? Is it something you're proud of? Well, I mean, clearly it will be, but is it one of the games up there that you think, this will be part of my legacy?
I think so. It's hard to say this early. It's hasn't been out for all that long in terms of, how old a lot of board games are these days. And it'll be something to see, does it receive a whole bunch of expansions like second edition did, or like Eldritch Horror did? And how does the feeling of the game kind of settle in over the years for players? A lot of my pride for the game, I would say, is going to be dependent on player opinion of it. Ultimately, I'm trying to create something that is going to bring joy and excitement to the players. And if I've created something that just doesn't do that well, I'm not going to feel as great about it, because I feel I could have created something better. But it's hard to tell this early. There's definitely people that are really enjoying it, and there's certainly the people that think it is a shallow version of what second edition was and what third edition could have been. So I'm still kind of feeling out the player opinion of it.
And so why did you decide to leave FFG then?
Mostly freedom. Just wanting to be able to work on my own games and have the freedom to be able to do what I wanted to do and to create what I wanted to create, and have something a little different. But there's a number of factors, but the main thing was just the being able to create anything that I felt I wanted to.
And was sort of stepping away from the security of a regular job, was that a difficult decision to make? Or did you just think, no, it served its purpose and I'm happy to pursue the path of freedom now?
It's definitely something that was on my mind and is still on my mind, even a year later, of just having a full-time position. It's a much more stable form of income, and all of the other things that come with it, having a kind of built-in support network of other developers and producers and the other coworkers that I had at FFG, many of whom are my dear friends. But there's also just so much more available to me as a freelancer than there was as a staff designer.
So your next choice then is one that all the designers that come on here seem to choose. So the cabin is not going to be short of packs of playing cards. So are you taking these for design aids or for the games that could be played with them?
I think it's both. I think the fact that playing cards get used as design aids is due to the fact of what they are. The same reason that there are so many different games you can play with a deck of playing cards is exactly the reason they're easy to work with as a designer in terms of coming up with new mechanics.
And so, chefs have knives, and I guess carpenters have their own set of tools. How integral are cards for the game designer? Are they sort of part of the toolbox that you always have?
They're a very useful tool, a very useful component. Not necessarily all games need to have cards. There are incredible games that don't have cards. But in terms of what are kind of the core tools available to us as designers, cards are very high on that list in terms of what they can give us and how we can use them.
And, do you have any favourite traditional card games? Games that you still play to this day?
So I'm a pretty big fan of Cribbage. Cribbage is a very cool game that's very unique from other card games as well. But has a kind of a similar thing to Mahjong, where it's got a lot of strategy to it, and you see more of the game the more of it you play, in terms of being able to understand it and know what the winning strategy is. But there are other games. I've played Hearts with my family for as long as I can remember, so trick-taking games like that, Hearts or Clubs or Spades or any of the other various versions of trick-taking games that exist. And then, so I have for many years now tried to keep a deck of playing cards on me at all times. You never know when you might just want to, play a quick game. And that actually started a long time ago with a lot of the time that I would spend with my mom, either after school or just like out for dinner or out for lunch or something, would be in a situation where we would just want to be talking about something, but we'd kind of want something else to do, and we would just play a few hands of gin rummy as we did that. And it was something that we just kind of enjoyed and became a tradition for us. And honestly, the fact that I played gin rummy for so long and its similarities to Mahjong is probably why I like Mahjong so much as well. It's got that very emotional draw to it for me because of my history with it.
And do you think games like this, traditional card games, trick-taking games, rummy, that sort of thing, are basically the cure for the awkward silence?
Maybe. I definitely am the type of person that it's hard for me to make small talk. It's difficult for me to kind of meet new people and maintain a conversation. And I think there's probably a lot of people like that, and they enjoy games because it gives you something to kind of fill that silence with, and something to share with those people that you might not know that well. But yeah, it's kind of something to do with your hands and keep you occupied while you are thinking or talking.
So I want to talk now about inclusivity in gaming. When you sent me your bio, you said that you were an advocate for inclusivity in gaming. What does that mean to you? And, you're someone who has lived in the RPG world and the board game world and the digital game world. Do they have their own particular set of problems, or is it the same?
It's a lot of the similar problems, and it's the same problems that are just in our societies in general. There is a certain amount of natural distrust of people that are different than us in our societies, that we're raised with that mentality. And it's something that I think would be good to kind of break from, to not teach our kids that, and to treat each other all as people, because we are. So to me, I want to create experiences where, and I want to create environments where everyone is welcome to be who they are and express themselves for what they believe in, but in a way that everyone should feel safe in their environment and in their groups of friends and everything else. And a lot of that is being able to show people that don't get shown that often. It's definitely a thing in fantasy games and fantasy genre as an entire genre, whether it's books or movies or whatever else. A lot of it is drawn from the same source material, and that source material is both old and not very inclusive to begin with. So a lot of the natural ways that many designers or many players try to create worlds or create characters is without regard for those who are different from them. And maybe they don't understand how much that feels othering and alienating to be exposed to on a constant basis.
And do you think that's born out of maliciousness or a lack of imagination? Simply, this is how it's always been, so I'll do it too.
I think for the most part, it's not intentionally malicious. It's perhaps ignorance or not having the empathy to understand others' needs or the desires or the fears that others have expressed. There are, I'm sure, some people that it is intentional and malicious, but I think in the most part it isn't that. It's just that there's the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding for each other in the community, which is why it's even more important that we do, spread this knowledge and talk about it and have representation of all peoples within our games and our stories.
And so, people have beliefs upon which they're intransigent. They just won't change those beliefs. Is sort of inclusivity about changing minds, or is it about the toleration of other people and the understanding that we just need to rub along together?
I think both of those sentiments are a bit problematic. It shouldn't be about changing minds, because for the people that truly believe that there shouldn't be diversity, those are the people that there is no saving their opinion. Those are the people that, frankly, I believe we should make an effort to cut from our community, because they are harming people, whether they believe it to be true or not. It is harmful to have those opinions. On the other hand, the other thing that you said about tolerating each other is also not the goal. It isn't that we should think of each other as less than, but put up with each other. It's that we should view each other as equals, that we are all people who deserve love and respect and the same opportunities as each other.
But it might not be a status issue. It may just be, I disagree with you fundamentally on this, but we share this interest, which is sitting around a table, and I'm willing to tolerate this aspect of you I disagree with to facilitate this aspect that we both enjoy.
I think it very much depends on what that disagreement is centered on. I myself am queer and non-binary. I have no interest in playing a game with someone who believes that my lifestyle is a sin, for instance. That is not something that I want to be exposed to, and I have no reason to put myself in harm to accommodate that person's wanting to game. There are plenty of people that I can play with who support me and believe in me and believe that I am a person in my own right and aren't just putting up with me. And I would feel the same way, or I would hope that many others feel the same way, that they don't have to put up with someone who is merely tolerating them to have a gaming experience.
Do you think to have a relationship with another person, sort of a friendship, you have to agree on everything? Or do you think that you can have points of disagreement that you choose not to debate and still have a valuable friendship?
There's definitely things that you can disagree with and still be friends. But there are some things that aren't arguments to begin with. There is no argument that a person of color is less than someone who is white. There is no argument that there are only two genders. There is no argument that being queer is wrong. Those are things that you can't just have a disagreement about that. The one person on that side of the argument actively has a hateful and harmful opinion that is bad for both them and the people they are involved with and the community.
And if we assume that some of these people who harbour these opinions are not too far gone to realise the error of their ways, how do we change their minds? How do we advocate for them to realise that people of colour aren't what they see on Fox News, or, that non-binary people do exist, that it's a real thing and it's not just a Twitter construction?
I think it can definitely be difficult with some people. Ultimately, these are just facts of our world, and if it is impossible to convince them of this thing, then they are lost in a way. In the same way that someone who believes that the Earth is flat, for instance, this is a belief that is harmful to their understanding of the world and can be harmful to the people around them. But if they refuse to listen to facts, there's not much we can do about it. But for our own safety, we may need to cut them from our lives.
And to what degree do you think the online world is a realistic analogue for the real world? Do you think Twitter is a realistic representation of what people really think, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask?
I think that people are much more than their physical bodies, and an online persona and online relationships are just as real as ones in person. The emotions that people convey online are just as real as the emotions they convey in person. And those things are what make us human.
I mean, do you think people take liberties online with the use of anonymity, with not being able to see sort of micro expressions on people's faces that they wouldn't take face to face? Or do you see a world in which people are becoming trolls in real life as well as on Twitter?
I think it's definitely true that some people do that. I would say that those are very likely people that lack some amount of empathy to begin with. If you are the type of person that thinks because you can't see them or because they don't know who you are, what you are doing is okay, or what you are doing doesn't actually hurt them, you're either ignoring the truth that you know to be true, or you're just not thinking about these other people as people.
I mean, have you ever... I've occasionally... I try to sort of avoid this now, and mostly I'm successful. But have you ever had the situation where you just fire off a tweet or a Facebook comment and you realise that the way you phrased it maybe was too strong, too harsh, and not really understanding the context in which you initially read the post? Or do you have very good netiquette?
I'm the type of person that is constantly worried that what I'm saying will unintentionally hurt someone. So virtually every tweet that I send, I've stared at it for far too long to make sure that it can't be misinterpreted in some other way that I wasn't thinking about originally. And a lot of times I kind of talk myself out of something that is very likely harmless, but I'm too afraid that it might hurt someone. So I choose not to put that into the world.
So I want to go on to your next game now, and this is probably the undoubted hit of last year, and this was The Mind. And in a lot of the discussion about The Mind, people were talking about how original, how innovative this game is. Do you think the game is revolutionary?
Absolutely. I completely see why it was such a splash, and I very much think it was the best game to come out of last year. It works with an aspect of gaming that very few things have worked with before, and that is empathy specifically. Its entire mechanic is about being able to read the other players and being able to understand them on an implicit level. It's not about talking or strategizing or anything else. It is merely feeling your fellow players empathically.
I mean, what I found amazing about The Mind is if you play it with a group of people, you find yourself getting better at it. Do you think empathy and that sort of, what you've termed as empathy, do you think that's sort of to some degree is a muscle that can be trained?
Absolutely. In the same way that your physical muscles can be trained, or you can practice strategies or learn how to, be better strategically. Empathy is absolutely something that can be trained and something that you can get better at. And what you're talking about with playing The Mind with the same group repeated times and getting better at it, that is what that is. You are learning to read those people better, and they are learning to connect with you better.
And what was your first reaction when you played it? Were you instantly astonished? Were you bemused? Or did it take time to grow on you? Or was it
It was instantaneous and overwhelming in some ways. I was astounded and amazed and confused at how easy it was to just... that the single mechanic was the game, but it was so simple and so perfect and did exactly what it wanted to do.
And what function do you think this would fulfill in the cabin?
Like Mahjong, The Mind to me is a very zen game. It's a very relaxing experience. And similar to just my deck of playing cards and playing gin rummy with my mom all those years, The Mind is just a great way to connect with people on a very deep level that helps you understand them and feel more attuned with who they are as people. The Mind is a game that I like to play while just having conversations, catching up with my friends, because the game itself doesn't require speech. It doesn't require thought necessarily. It's just that sense that you have with it. So it's very easy to hold a conversation at the same time that you're playing The Mind without it disrupting the game or disrupting the conversation.
So I want to talk now about the future. So what do you have coming up in the future?
I have a game coming up I think it comes out around Gen Con. I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely playable at Gen Con, called Quirky Circuits. And this is a cooperative action programming game. So you and the other players would be working together to put down these cards that are commands that you're giving to a robot of some kind to have it complete a mundane task. And I specifically say mundane task here because what I'm asking you to make this robot do as a designer is relatively simple compared to all the things that you might expect these games to do. But the challenge is, very similarly to the mind, is that you need to do this without communication directly. You can't talk to the other players or discuss what your strategy is or anything like that. All you have to go on is the fact that you know where the robot is and you know what your shared goal is with the other players, and you can see the cards that are available to your other players and the cards that have already been played into a queue. But the information you have about those cards is very limited. You only know, for instance, I'm holding 2 cards that cause the robot to move and a card that causes it to turn, but not how it moves, how far it moves, which direction it turns. None of that information is known to you. But if I choose to play down a card, it is easy to assume that it's easy to assume what I'm attempting to do because we have the same shared goal.
And so, what would you define as a Nikki Valens game? When if someone was to come to one of your games, what would the experience be that they'd get?
It's a great question. It's one that I've actually been thinking about a lot this past year, and just trying to figure out what that means to me, like what kind of games I want to design. One of the reasons that I left FFG was that I was very kind of pegged as one thing. I was the narrative designer or the horror designer, and most of my games were that singular thing. But that isn't all that I care about. I do get pegged as the narrative designer a lot still because of that, and it's not necessarily that I feel that all of my games need to be narrative. It is simply that I like to tell stories, and I think stories make good experiences. But something like Quirky Circuits, like I was just talking about, is very, very different from something like Eldritch Horror. It's a very light game. The aesthetic is very different. The mood of the game is very different from the narrative adventure games that I've created in the past. But I'm very excited for people to play it, and I think it's going to be some really fun times for people. And maybe it starts to kind of break away that shell of Nikki as the narrative designer, and we'll see what other cool things I can come up with. So I'm not entirely sure yet what exactly a Nikki Valens game is, but my hope is that all of them are fun.
So your last game then is the Shipwreck Arcana, and this is a co-op. This is another co-op game. What is it about co-op games, and what does the Shipwreck Arcana do that sort of exemplifies the value in co-op games?
So this one is on my list to represent kind of 2 things. One is co-op games, which we're going to talk about, and the other is logic puzzles, because it gets to fulfill both of those roles as a game on my shelf. So to me, co-op games is just a more interesting form of games, in my opinion. I like to enjoy my time with my friends and family. I don't want to feel that we are in a competition, at least not a strict competition of any kind. I don't want to have the feeling that my friends are working against me. That just doesn't feel good to me. It doesn't, give me a good mood afterward. But co-op games, we get to work together to solve a challenge or to overcome something. And that's much more fulfilling to me, to be able to work together with the people I love to work toward the same goal.
And so you say this game is also a logic puzzle. I am completely inept at anything that sort of functions around logic and deduction. Is this something that triggers your excitement, and are you particularly adept?
I really, really love logic puzzles and solving stuff like this. It probably goes back to, I have a very analytical and kind of mathy mind, and those reasons are why I got into programming. My favorite part of programming is when something does go wrong and I need to debug my code and figure out what's causing it to work the way it is working. And that's possible because the computer that I'm working with is a completely logical device. It is doing exactly what I've told it to do. So I need to find where I've told it something incorrectly. And knowing why it is doing that is a really cool challenge to me, to being able to find what's wrong with it. And logic puzzles in general are the same way. We know that they must work in a specific way, and thus there is a solution to it. And working out what that solution is just a very cool problem to have encountered. And then this specifically being a co-op game, I get to work with my friends to solve these logical puzzles, to create, great memories and experiences and reach a solution that is the only possible solution that we could have gotten to.
So I've got one last question then. So you're herring away from the city, fleeing the apocalypse, and you go around a corner and the back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out, down a ravine, into a river, and are swept away forever. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
I think it has to be Mahjong. It's definitely the game that if someone told me I could only play one game for the rest of my life, Mahjong is the one that I would choose. Assuming, of course, that we've got people to play the games with.
So, if people want to get hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
The best way is to contact me on Twitter. You can find me at Valens116. It's just my last name, so VALENS 116. You can direct message me there, or just, mention me in something if you want to. And if you want my email, you can direct message me on Twitter to get it as well. I try to keep my email to just professional stuff when possible.
So, Nikki Valens, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. And if you feel like looking swanky, you can get some handsome 5G4D merch at tpublic.com/user/5gamesfordoomsday. And if I haven't had to liberate myself from the Champagne Socialists and the Boris Johnson commemorative tableware, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.